Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international questions with a major US security analyst. And our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Daniel Serwer, professor at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies, and one of Washington's leading Balkan specialists. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled The Spectre of Partition. The spectre of partition is haunting the Balkans. After several provocative statements by Serbian and Kosovar politicians, and in the midst of relative silence from Washington and Brussels, suppositions are growing that a territorial exchange is being planned between Belgrade and Pristina. The US and the EU have consistently opposed any border changes, viewing such moves as dangerous in a still volatile region. But rumours are now swirling that Washington and Brussels may seek to resolve the Serbia-Kosovo dispute through a territorial option and have launched a trial balloon to see what Belgrade and Pristina can agree on without direct international mediation. Historically, partitions or territorial exchanges are nothing new, whether through post-war adjustments by the victorious parties or on the basis of democratic plebiscites or intergovernmental agreements. While Yugoslavia was dismembered through wars and elections, Moscow was unable to hold the Soviet Union together by force, and Czechoslovakia was amicably divided by Prague and Bratislava. In each case, however, the new countries were former federal subjects possessing clear administrative borders and elected governments. Potential land swaps between Kosovo and Serbia would legitimize a new principle, the partition of states that emerged from the defunct communist federations. Such a process would require at least 4 conditions to be realized peacefully. First, because only sovereign states can exchange territory, Serbia and Kosovo would need to recognize each other as independent countries and not block entry into international institutions. Second, popular approval in both countries would need to be secured, either through parliament or a public referendum. Third, international mediation would be essential to implement any territorial agreements. And fourth, the citizens affected would have to be assisted in relocating to the state of their choice. But even if all these conditions were met, border changes in the Balkans are fraught with perils and would be interpreted throughout the region as legitimizing national homogenization. With the principle of multi-ethnicity evidently jettisoned, demands for mono-ethnicity would escalate and potentially unravel several countries, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, and even Serbia itself. Western institutions and NATO forces may find themselves woefully unprepared for the wave of instability that could subsequently engulf the region. Although such a scenario sounds like a Balkan bonanza for the Kremlin and justify its partition of Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, it would be premature for Moscow to celebrate. Such developments would underscore that the Russian Federation itself, containing 85 federal units, may also be territorially divided according to ethnic, religious or regional principles. Paradoxically, the partition of Kosovo or Bosnia could serve as a prototype for Russia's future dissolution. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Daniel Serwer, professor at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and one of Washington's leading Balkan specialists. Thank you, Dan, for joining me.
My pleasure.
I want to focus today on a question that has preoccupied the West Balkan region throughout the summer. I thought it would be a quiet summer, particularly August, but it turns out not to have been. And that's the question of partition, potential territorial exchanges between states in the region, and specifically between Kosovo and Serbia. Now, my first question is, I want to start with the bigger picture. Can you explain to us the difference between the partition of Yugoslavia, as it happened in the 1990s, and the partition of states that subsequently emerged from Yugoslavia after the wars?
The key thing to understand is that the partition of Yugoslavia, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, occurred along previously well-established lines. So internal boundaries were made into international borders, but they weren't moved to accommodate ethnic differences. And this is fundamental to what was done in the 1990s and ever since. The Badinter Commission set those rules, essentially, when it decided that a majority referendum in each republic would be necessary in order for independence to be declared. Kosovo, of course, was a strange case because it wasn't a republic.
Right.
It had a representative on the collective presidency, but it was nominally an autonomous province within Serbia. So its status was ambiguous, and whether it had the right to secession was never really decided in the early days.
So that what you would say is the difference. You had, let's say, republics of a country with set borders, elected local authorities, if you like, that could easily be recognized.
And there were pre-existing lines that everybody was pretty much happy with.
Well, one could argue that the war actually did ethnically cleanse those units. If you look at the mass slaughter of Bosniaks in particular in Bosnia, the creation of Republika Srpska, even in Croatia, the fleeing or the expulsion of Serbian population, there are those that say, well, ethnically homogeneous, largely homogeneous states were created. That's why they succeeded.
That's true to some degree. I haven't met anybody lately who regards Bosnia as a great success. And I think the homogenization is part of the problem that it has had ever since the war. I see homogenization more as a problem than as a solution. Why is it a problem? Well, very clearly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, if there's a partition, it has to be a three-way partition. Croat, Serb, and Bosniak, which leaves you with an Islamic republic, what we used to call in the State Department a non-viable rump Islamic republic landlocked inside central Bosnia. Who would that republic ally itself with? Well, certainly during the war we believed it would be Iran, and we believed that Iran would make it a platform for terrorism in Europe. That was an explicit consideration for the Americans during the war in Bosnia. That concern should be much greater now, given the history since the 1990s and the emergence of much stronger Islamic extremists than existed in the 90s. So I don't see homogenization as a solution. I see it as a problem.
So are you discounting any territorial exchanges as a solution from the outset? In other words, no possibility that Belgrade and Pristina can try and, let's say, recognize each other, normalize their relations through a land swap? You don't think this is feasible?
Let's be clear. Sovereign states that recognize each other can certainly legally swap territory. The United States has done it. Lots of countries have done it. They usually do it to adjust to a river that's moved someplace, and they want to keep the border at the river rather than on dry land, that kind of thing. I don't have any objection legally to Serbia and Kosovo doing that. There's no problem legally if they recognize each other and establish diplomatic relations. I do have an objection if the motive for doing it is not exchange of territory, but exchange of population and an effort to homogenize the population. That's inconsistent with liberal democratic principles and points in the wrong direction for both Serbia and Kosovo.
Which in the Serbia-Kosovo case, going by what you're saying, is why swap territory anyway? They could swap the populations between Preševo and northern Kosovo, which would also be ethnic homogenization.
Yes, they could. I mean, that kind of thing was done in the 1920s between Greece and Turkey. it requires that you force people to move. And there's no way of doing that and meeting contemporary human rights standards. The exchange between Greece and Turkey couldn't occur today in the same way that it occurred then. I don't see any reason why Serbs in Kosovo can't be protected in Kosovo and why Albanians in Serbia can't be protected in Serbia. Certainly if both countries aim at acceding to the European Union, they must be able to protect the minorities within their populations. That's one of the key requirements of the European Union.
Presumably, if Serbia recognized Kosovo, they could establish normal bilateral relations and protect their own minority populations from the other ethnic group. But as you know, there is this blockage for Serbia to recognize Kosovo. Do you see anything in this other than smoke and mirrors by the two presidents in Pristina and Belgrade?
I think it's more than smoke and mirrors, but I think we need to recognize what some of the political motives are, because politicians don't just respond to international concerns, they respond to their own population's concerns. So Alexander Vučić is looking at this and saying to himself, you know, if I'm going to bite the bullet, take the bitter pill of recognizing Kosovo, I have to visibly get something for it. And he's been quite explicit about that in public. So he's facing a domestic political situation where he feels he needs to get something. I don't really think he does. He commands almost 100% of the domestic political scene, but he's saying he does need that. Vučić was listening to all of this claim over northern Kosovo by Belgrade and saying to himself, this is crazy. I can't agree to unilateral giving away of territory. I need an exchange. If we're even going to talk about it, it has to be on the basis of exchange. And besides which, the LDK and Lutfi Haziri are making some political hay advocating this idea. So why don't I respond to Vučić saying I want Preševo if there's to be any kind of territorial maneuver? That's what got us here, I think.
Just like a game of cards, maybe poker or something.
Yes, it's a game of cards, but it includes the Americans and the Europeans.
I'm going to come to that in a moment.
Because the Serbs were very active in lobbying for this in Washington and in Brussels. And the international mood has turned in their direction in the sense that we have an ethnic nationalist president of the United States. Ethnic nationalism has infected the European Union, especially Poland, Hungary, and Italy, Netherlands. I mean, it gets hard to list all of them. And so the mood has changed. This dissolution with liberal democracy, there's more affection for ethnic nationalism.
Do you think, though, in Serbia's case, you say Vučić has to show that he gains something, but according to this proposal, if it is a proposal, he'll also lose Preševo Valley, which is actually strategically much more important for Serbia than northern Kosovo.
I won't... They're discussing this, and they want to discuss it. They've discussed it in the past. Now they're discussing it publicly. I don't believe there is a deal here that both will feel comfortable agreeing to. I think the discussion is destabilizing, not only for the Balkans, but more broadly. So I'm against it as a proposition, but I'm also not favorable to discussion of it, and for some very concrete and, I think, good reasons.
Right. In the past, you mentioned earlier, states have to recognize each other, but there also have been plebiscites, referenda. Also, the people affected, because as you say, this would be the movement of people, not just changing the line along the border, river, and so forth. That affects people's lives, people's jobs, people's land. You know, how attached peasants are to land. So this will have a major, presumably such a major impact that it could provoke violence.
I think it's almost certain to promote violence if it's attempted.
Mm-hmm.
And it could provoke violence not only against Albanians who happen to live in the north, because there are some Albanians who still live in the north, and there are certainly Serbs who live in the Preševo Valley.
Mm-hmm.
It could also provoke violence against Serbs who live south of the Ibar and against Albanians who live elsewhere inside Serbia.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest concern has to be about the Serbs who live south of the Ibar, because if Kosovo gives away the north, certainly the Serbs south of the Ibar believe that their hold on being able to continue there will be enormously weakened. Ask Father Sava about that. He's very convinced.
Yeah.
And I think his concerns are real, and I think they're really quite compelling. Vučić is an odd sort of Serbian nationalist because he cares about Serbs, but he doesn't care much about the religious institutions and monuments. He's not that kind of Serb nationalist.
Secular nationalist.
He's more of a secular nationalist, and has shown very little concern about the majority of Serbs in Kosovo who live south of the Ibar.
Right. So the church, the Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox Church, as you say, adamantly opposes this. Could they be at the forefront of opposition to such a plan?
Well, I certainly think in Serbia they should be at the forefront of opposition. Certainly the church inside Kosovo has spoken loudly. The church in Belgrade hasn't spoken as loudly, and I think someone coming at this from my point of view would hope that the church in Belgrade would speak more loudly than it has.
In other words, yeah.
But I also think Albanians in Kosovo who are proud of their new state and who are determined to take it in a liberal democratic direction should also speak loudly against the proposition which essentially says we can't rely on the Kosovo state to treat Serbs correctly. And that, it seems to me, is a canard, and one that if I were a Kosovar, I would want to eliminate that idea from consideration.
Well, the opposition within Kosovo is quite broad. I mean, in government, in the opposition, in civic society. These petitions have been signed by different organizations and activists.
Yeah, it surprised me, to tell you the truth. I wouldn't have necessarily expected such a broad opposition. But I think it's in part, frankly, broad opposition to Thaçi and his dominance of the political scene, as much as it is opposition or to the partition proposal, the swap proposal. And it certainly doesn't entirely reflect concern about the treatment of Serbs inside Kosovo, which I think should be a major concern for Kosovars today. For Kosovars, their ability to get into the European Union, to get into NATO, depends on their capacity to treat Serbs and other minorities correctly. In fact, all citizens of the state of Kosovo.
You raise a very important point in that it's not even the fact of the partition, but raising the issue on the international agenda, on the bilateral agenda between countries in the region, can destabilize. Can you sort of extrapolate? I want to give a few examples to our audience. For instance, what impact would this have on countries such as Macedonia? We'll come back to Bosnia in a minute. In terms of the Pan-Albanian program or the Pan-Serbian program.
Well, let's take Macedonia. It's about to face a referendum on an agreement with Greece for which it's waited for 25 years. I think the agreement's a very good one from the Macedonian perspective. It allows people to continue to call themselves Macedonians and their language Macedonian. I've told the Macedonians, I'll call your country Macedonia until you ask me to stop. It'll be officially North Macedonia. Big deal. It's a good agreement. It needs not only 50% of voters to vote in favor. It needs 50% of voters
Turnout.
on the voter rolls to turn up. If I'm an Albanian in Macedonia who's not that keen on remaining in Macedonia, who might hope for a greater Kosovo someday, to remove that border, which was, after all, a very soft border during the socialist period. There are people with family on both sides. It's not like the Albania-Macedonia border, the Albania-Kosovo border, very hard border during the Cold War. It was a soft border, and I might like that border to get soft real quick. Do I want to go out and vote? I might not want to vote against, because Albanians generally have wanted a settlement of the name issue. But am I going to bother to go out to vote for something that really isn't entirely in my interest, that helps to solve a problem I might not
or maybe simply a temporary solution to this?
So, you know, why should I go out and vote? Now, I haven't heard that much from Albanians in Macedonia, but I'm concerned about it. No one predicting the outcome of referenda is obviously extraordinarily difficult, but predicting the turnout for a referendum is even more difficult. So I am concerned about that. And there might be Macedonians on the other side of the ethnic divide in Macedonia who also say, why should we do this? If we don't approve this, maybe there'll be a partition, and then we'll be able to have our country Macedonia, only Macedonia, with only Macedonians. That's a quixotic.
But then you have the Bulgarian.
That's a quixotic hope. Well. There's the Bulgarian problem, which you can talk to better than I can. But there's also the very simple problem of the major Albanian city in Macedonia, which is Shkup. And you're going to divide Skopje. I mean, division of Macedonia is a crazy idea, and we all recognize that. But it could happen unintentionally if this name agreement isn't approved.
Further afield, of course, Albania itself will be affected. How does the government in Tirana react to Kosovo's potential partition, movement towards separation in Macedonia?
I'd be very surprised if there's any politician in Albania of any significance who thinks that Greater Albania is a good idea. Why? Because the capital of Greater Albania is in Pristina. It's not in Tirana. Pristina is the heart of Albanian nationalism. But by the same token, I don't think many politicians in Pristina want to think about whether they might have to move their capital to Tirana.
Or become regional governors or something.
Or become regional governors. They're not keen on that. The Kosovo state is a nice cushy job for some people. So I think opening the Pandora's box and enabling the possibility of Greater Albania is problematic for politicians in both Tirana and Pristina, and it might account for why some of them are opposed to Thaçi's proposal.
We haven't had in the region, though, at least not to my knowledge in recent weeks, any major statements against such a plan. I haven't heard this from the Macedonian government or from the Albanian government. Have you heard anything from political leaders in neighboring countries?
Well, I certainly have heard it
publicly.
I've heard it privately from the Macedonians. I think everybody's being very cautious. They want to protect their equities with Brussels, with Berlin, with Washington.
Yeah.
You know, I think there are a lot of people who recognize, especially in the current Macedonian government, which is a liberal democratic government. I think they're very concerned about this. They don't want to become protagonists of it. It's somebody else's business.
But they're fearful, as you said, presumably, that it could scuttle the referendums, cut through the agreement with Greece, and set Macedonia back several years, even without separatism.
Exactly.
Let's move on to Bosnia as well, because you mentioned the let's say the example. We've had these plans before of dividing Bosnia, which luckily came to nothing. But how would Bosnia be divided? Because in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, there's something to exchange. There's nothing to exchange between Muslims and Serbs here.
Look, let's be clear. If it's legal for two presidents of sovereign states to exchange territory and populations, that doesn't make it legal for a part of a country whose president is not a sovereign, even though he claims to be, to take his country to take his entity out of Bosnia. There's nothing legal about that. Legally, it's not analogous to a Vučić-Thaçi agreement.
Yeah.
It's completely different. But there are so many other arguments that militate against this, because it does strengthen Dodik politically. He's an ethnic nationalist who basically says...
This Milorad Dodik, the president.
Milorad Dodik basically says, we have to have our own Serb entity, okay, a few minorities scattered here and there, less than 20% in Republika Srpska, not politically significant on most days. They can live with that. But if he were to declare independence, call a referendum, declare independence, what would ensue would unquestionably be violence. And the violence would occur both within Republika Srpska and between Republika Srpska and forces in the Federation. This is a very dangerous place to be. We know what happened in the 90s. I don't think the same thing can happen.
Right.
What happened in the 90s had Milosevic, who had military capabilities and political commitment that doesn't exist in Bosnia today. But a short war involving violence, a Bosniak effort to seize Brčko, a Bosnian Serb effort to seize Brčko, a clash there, probably of days duration, not weeks even, could be the end of peace and stability in Bosnia. And you may not like today's Bosnian state. It's not pretty, it's not very functional, but it's a hell of a lot better than war.
And as you mentioned, we're on the eve of elections as well in Bosnia in October. How will this, even the discussion between Kosovo and Serbia on this partition question, how will this impact on the election campaign?
Well, it strengthens the nationalists, who hardly need strengthening in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because the Constitution strengthens them so massively. Bosnia and Herzegovina has had a non-nationalist, avowedly non-nationalist prime minister for only a year since the war. I mean, the nationalists with whom we negotiated the Dayton agreements knew exactly what they were doing. And they made a constitution and a state that ensured their hold on power. Now, there are some of them unhappy because their particular political party wasn't ensured a hold on power. And that's Čović's problem, the Bosnian Croat leader. But ethnic nationalists have governed Bosnia since the war, and they will be enormously strengthened by even this discussion of partition, land swap, people swap between Kosovo and Serbia.
So is the Pandora's box being opened here, would you say, in
There's
the
no
region?
question. Pandora's box is open already. It's open already, and Dodik is immediately said, well, if Kosovo is going to be recognized by Serbia, then RS, Republika Srpska, has to be independent. I mean, there's no question but that. And people in the State Department, if you talk to them, will say, yeah, but legally that's nonsense. That's just trash because he's not he's not the sovereign. He doesn't get to decide unilaterally. But look, politics is politics. And there are moments when legalities matter less than politics.
The other part of it, which I would say is even more dangerous, is how this could draw both Serbia and Croatia into a conflict inside Bosnia.
But I would say this, look, Serbia, I think, recognizes that it cannot support independence for Republika Srpska or even recognize an independent Republika Srpska, nor I think could it do much openly to support military action by Republika Srpska. But the Russians aren't so restrained.
Right.
The Russians are pumping weapons and training into the Republika Srpska police. With respect to Croatia, I think there is some risk there, but the risk is more a political risk than a military risk. I think what you've got in Croatia is a revival of Croatian ethnic nationalism that would promote the idea of restoring Herceg Bosna, which hasn't, we like to think it was destroyed years ago by Paddy Ashdown, but in fact it wasn't completely destroyed. Certainly the idea wasn't destroyed. And Croatia would want to reconstruct Herceg Bosna, and it might have the opportunity to do that if the Bosniaks were preoccupied with Republika Srpska.
My point in terms of Serbia and Croatia was not that Vučić would want the same with Bosnia as he wants with Kosovo, but that if there is violence, in other words, if there's let's say the Republika Srpska has a referendum secession, the Muslims oppose it, you can imagine, as you say, firefights over Brčko and other places. This could draw Serbia into a conflict, presumably to protect its kindred in a neighboring country.
It could, but I think they'd think 4 times before they did that. Openly. Surreptitiously, that's another question. And
you could do it through proxies.
You could do it through proxies, or you can let the Russians have lots of arms they can give. So I think the real gainer from all of this outside the region would be Putin.
Well, let's turn to Russia, actually. What is Russian strategy in the region? Would they want, let's say, Pandora's box to be so completely open that you have violence and uncertainty rolling over the region?
I don't think they're aiming at that. I'm not sure that they would be particularly unhappy with it. What they're aiming for is to prevent NATO membership as much as they possibly can. The Macedonia is the immediate issue because it gets into NATO next year if this referendum passes. So they're doing their best, both in Greece and in Macedonia, to try to prevent the referendum from passing.
Even the Greeks expelled a couple of Russian diplomats, which is unheard of.
And I got to say, the Russians have been quite daring with other countries. The attempted assassination of Djukanovic. I don't know what they'll pull in the next 30 days or so, 25 days. That said, I think there's also real concern about their behavior inside Bosnia and Herzegovina because they really are arming the Serb police beyond the level that's required to keep law and order in the Republika Srpska at present. Of course, what that creates is a security dilemma, because then the Bosniaks feel threatened by that. They have to arm themselves a little bit more. And then the RS says, well, look what the Bosniaks are doing.
So it's escalating.
It's escalating. It's what political scientists call a security dilemma. And it can go to a very bad place. Which
could presumably we could be faced with a situation of Russian proxies and Russian weapons.
But the
propping up this entity.
That's right. And the Russians, what's their goal? Prevent NATO membership. Macedonia, I hope they fail. In Bosnia, I hope they fail too, but I think they have much greater chances of success. Republika Srpska is not cooperating in any real way with enabling Bosnia and Herzegovina to think about NATO membership. So I think the Russians have real chance of succeeding there. Of course, the big prize for them is Serbia. They really want to keep Serbia out of NATO because Serbia is the most powerful country in the region, always will be, and its distaste for NATO has vastly increased since the bombing. I was in Belgrade right after the bombing. Frankly, people were not terribly upset about it at the time. Even nationalists who understood perfectly well why NATO had bombed Serbia. What's happened in the years since then is that there's been an enormous buildup of resentment against the bombing by ethnic nationalists. And that will probably last a long time. I don't think NATO needs Serbia, but I don't think Serbia is likely to join NATO either. So I don't see a big problem with that.
As you said, for the Russians, it's also a question of keeping these countries out of NATO, but also out of the EU.
Yeah, when it comes to the EU, I think they're a little bit more ambivalent. I think they realize the commitment in the EU direction is much harder for them to disrupt. That said, if they can keep ethnic nationalism alive, it really does hurt prospects for EU accession.
Presumably it also helps to discredit NATO and American role in the Balkans, because they can say, look, you've been here 20 years. What have you solved? We have a new conflict. We have a new war. We have new partitions.
Well, let me say a word about that, because that's true, all of it. And there are terrible problems still in the Balkans of corruption and state capture. But things are much better than they were 20 years ago.
Oh, you don't have to convince me.
Per capita incomes in most countries are up by more or less a factor of 3.
Right.
There's no mass atrocity anyplace in the Balkans. People didn't complain about corruption and state capture when there was mass murder going on. There was still corruption and state capture then. Now, mass murder is gone. People have 3 times the incomes that they once upon a time had. We can afford to be complaining about state capture and corruption. And by that, I don't mean to minimize those complaints. I think it's very important for the Balkans countries to clean themselves up. But look, things are much, much better. The enterprise that the EU and the US launched, especially around the year 2000, around the Sarajevo summit, of opening the EU prospect for the entire region, is an extraordinary project. I mean, it's generous, it's ambitious, it's visionary.
Yeah.
And I would bet that all of the countries of the Balkans are more than halfway to EU accession. That in another 10 or 15 or 20 years, all of them will have made it.
Sure.
And that, to me, is extraordinary and positive.
Absolutely. I'm looking at it from Russia propaganda, Moscow's propaganda and disinformation, and how that impacts on some gullible people who are likely to believe it. Could it be also that a war, a conflict, uncertainty, in the Balkans acts as a diversion for Russia to strike elsewhere? In other words, you preoccupy NATO, American leadership in this region. You're giving yourself a bit more space somewhere like Ukraine, Baltic states, Caucasus.
I suppose somebody in Moscow may be thinking that, but frankly, I don't think NATO is going to be very concerned about the Balkans. I don't think a lot of ships are going to be diverted or satellites diverted to look at the Balkans. I think NATO is going to keep its focus on Ukraine, on Syria, on Afghanistan, on the more important theaters. I think that's part of the problem today, that you don't have the clarity of American diplomatic and military leadership that you once had, partly because we've got problems elsewhere, bigger problems elsewhere, and partly because we have an ethnic nationalist administration.
I was going to come to that. Could you explain to our viewers this a little bit more? Because a lot of people ask me, and will be asking me when I'm next in Kosovo, has US policy changed towards the region?
It has changed. It's a small change in the following sense. The very extensive Serb lobbying convinced the administration to listen to these territorial population swap proposals. The administration has not agreed to them, but it has agreed to hear Thaci and Vučić on anything that they can come to an agreement on.
Right.
That's my understanding of American policy. That's a change. In the past, this was ruled out the way Merkel ruled it out. My views are much closer to Merkel's than to the Trump administration, but I don't think we should exaggerate the change. It's a change of emphasis. It asks, well, show us what you can come up with, and what's the alternative to doing something like this? So it's not a dramatic change, but it is having some pretty dramatic effects on thinking in the region.
Would you say there are no longer red lines? In other words, no partition, no joining of other states, which was meant against the sort of Greater Albania, Greater Serbia program?
No, I think that states it too broadly, because I think there is a red line with regard to partition of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think the only red line that's moved is that we used to say no discussion of land and population swaps between sovereign states. Now people are essentially saying, well, if you can come up with something that you both agree to, we'll look at.
Yeah, and you may have agreed upon it, but as you said earlier, there's going to be political opposition, social opposition. How do you implement this?
I have no idea how Hashim Thaci could get approval in the Kosovo parliament for this. There are people speculating it won't go to the parliament, it'll be the constitutional court. I think that's wacko. I think this is, it requires a change in the Kosovo constitution, which has to pass by 2/3.
This is more important than an election. This is the future of the country.
This is the future of the country. I see no way to get this approved in Kosovo. I'm not sure I see much way to get it approved in Serbia either, because in Serbia there'll be a lot of concern about giving away Preševo. And without the Preševo part of the equation,
it's dead.
It's dead.
Yeah,
but it's dead also without some other things, and this is important to understand. Kosovars who know their business are saying, look, this has to include not only recognition, exchange of ambassadors, but membership in the UN.
Right.
And membership in the UN is not something Belgrade can deliver.
That's a good point. Then back to Russia again.
Back to Russia again. And the Russians will have no reason to approve it in the Security Council, where it has to be approved before going to the General Assembly, unless they get something for it. And they will want Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, Donbass. I mean, you know, this is a much bigger issue than just Kosovo and Serbia.
It is, and they'll lose one of the levers they have against Serbia, or for Serbia. In other words, the whole recognition, UN recognition question.
That's exactly right. So I don't think a deal here is likely to happen if Kosovars and Serbs really focus on their interests. That said, it's not that I think the current uncertain, let us call, contested sovereignty of Kosovo will continue forever. Because Serbia has to settle this problem before it accedes to the European Union.
Right.
And that is, I don't think that's as far off as some people might think. Serbia has capacities to implement the acquis communautaire that could enable a serious move for accession, if not in 2023, when in essence the window opens, a few years after that. I mean, that is closer than it used to be.
And I think that must be one of Vucic's calculations. He wants to leave a legacy of being the guy who brought Serbia into the European Union.
Right, and he knows, because I've told him and everybody else has told him, that Serbia's leverage in the final stages before accession is zero. Countries that are about to accede to the European Union, whether it's Slovenia, whether it's Croatia, whether it's Montenegro, they all have to give up on those final issues. So he's trying to settle this in advance when he can hope to get something.
Yeah.
Rather than let it slide till the last moment when he can get nothing.
Exactly. What is the EU role in this whole debate? I mean, what's been marked as the silence or hesitation to say anything other than Angela Merkel? I haven't heard very much.
Well, I mean, there are some EUers who have been positive about this and who are essentially echoing the Americans.
But from Tusk
but I think
I
think it's very difficult for the Union as a whole to take a position because of the 5 non-recognizers, and because the attitudes of Poland, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands governments of the moment will be quite different from Merkel's attitude. So I think it's very difficult for the Union to play a strong role here, except for one thing, which is that in the end, all the countries of the Union, the existing members, have to approve a treaty for accession. So if Merkel is being tough on this, she sets the red line. There's no... she doesn't have to compromise, and frankly I don't think she can compromise, because the Bundestag won't approve an accession treaty that breaches her red line.
Last couple of questions, Dan. I wanted to look at, again, turn back to the domestic questions, particularly in Kosovo. Do you think this whole thing is a deliberate distraction by President Taci from his political opposition, from the fact of Kosovo continues to stagnate, there's poor governance, corruption, and so forth?
I wouldn't call it a deliberate distraction. I would say that he seems to have felt that he was being outmaneuvered on this issue by the LDK, and he decided to outflank them rather than continue to hold to the previous position. But let's face it, this question of the land and population swaps has been discussed extensively between Vucic and Taci. There's no question about that. What I don't know is how close they've gotten to an agreement. But I know they've talked about it quite a bit over a period of years. The new thing here is that they've decided to talk about it publicly, not that they've talked about it. I mean, of course it's been talked about for a long time. Presumably
at some point, this whole Brussels process is going to have to be integrated in that. It's going to have to, the partition, this question, if there is an agreement between Taci and Vucic, will have to be raised at the level of with the EU negotiators.
Well, I think that's right. And I think you can expect that fairly soon, since both presidents are saying they want to talk about it. I mean, I have a problem telling presidents that they can't talk about something that they want to talk about. I have no problem telling them how many problems it raises with other countries, both in the region and beyond, and how many problems it will raise even in their own countries that they don't seem to have taken fully into account.
Do you think our leaders and EU leaders, because we've come from a tradition, we saw what happened in the Balkans 20-odd years ago. You have a whole new slew of politicians who don't have that experience.
They have none of it. Some of them were even opposed to the interventions in the Balkans. I hope it's not too forward for me to say that I've recognized this for some years, that our politicians, our foreign service officers, don't understand what was done in the Balkans and why. So I've written a book which will be published in December by Palgrave Macmillan,
Good time to plug
which discusses what happened and why, what the achievements have been, what the continuing problems are, and how you should apply the lessons of the Balkans to places like the Middle East and Ukraine, because Putin and others are always claiming, and people opposed to Putin and others are always claiming that we should do a no-fly zone the way we did in the Balkans, or we should do this the way we did in the Balkans. And I think you have to examine those propositions very carefully.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is From War to Peace, in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Ukraine.
Okay, and that's out in December.
That's out in December.
I'll encourage my viewers to buy it. Very last question, Dan. I mean, is there a possibility, I'm basically an optimist, once this issue is discussed and it's realized as unfeasible, will we then get back to the real problems, the real questions that need to be resolved in Kosovo? Economy, corruption, government mismanagement and so forth. Will we go back to basics?
Well, it's difficult to predict what will come next politically. A lot depends, it seems to me, on how Kosovars vote. And I'm not in a position to be able to predict that. And I'm happy to say that, because that's what real democracy is about, is not knowing who the next prime minister or the next president is going to be. But I do think that even if it's not intentional, this discussion and the whole discussion of completing sovereignty in Kosovo has distracted from some of the more important problems. I don't think it's necessarily...
You don't think it's deliberate?
I don't think it's Thatchy manufacturing things to distract attention.
It's a byproduct.
But I think it's a product. And I think we all need to try to help Kosovars and Serbs, because Serbs face very serious problems with corruption, with freedom of the media. At least I can say that the media in Kosovo is freer than it is in Serbia, and with the independence of the courts. And those three problems are precisely the same problems that I would put at the top of the list in Kosovo.
Good point, Dan. We'll have to end on that note, because we've come to the end of our time. But it's great to have you. Thank you very much for joining me. And I'm sure we'll have you back in the future, because this issue isn't going to go away. Thanks, Dan. All the best with the book as well.
You're welcome.
Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.